The video you just started watching is the second episode of my critique of Mental Health Master concerning minor attracted people. I'm assuming you've seen the first part, but even if you haven't, that's no problem. You should still be able to make sense of these criticisms. This part focuses on the problematics of stigmatization. As most anti-pedos, Quinton, that is Mental Health Master, has his own hypothesis for why we need stigma against pedophiles. Let's hear it from the man himself, shall we?
If we look at the statistics for child abuse, 1 in 3 girls are sexually abused before the age of 18, 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused before the age of 18, 1 in 5 children are solicited sexually while on the internet before the age of 18. 90% of child sexual abuse victims know the perpetrator in some way. And it seems to me that normalization would only lead to avenues for perpetrators to get to know potential victims. And that isn't to say that every individual who is attracted to children will become a perpetrator. What I am saying is that as much as it would make life easier for those individuals, it would also make it easier for anybody who chooses to act on that attraction to engage in that relationship or to set up that relationship with a potential victim.
Now, I can't be certain of what Quinton means by normalization, but my honest interpretation is that given the whole context of his arguments, he's basically against removing stigma, which is something he calls normalization. But more to the point, I'm not at all convinced by this assertion that in the absence of stigma against pedophiles, offenders would have more opportunities to molest. First off, Quinton doesn't provide any actual mechanism for why that would be the case. He just seems to assert that as his intuition, but when you're persuading others, you need to do a little more than just claim stuff. Secondly, what's up with those statistics he brings up? Assuming they're true, they still have absolutely no bearing on this issue. That data mostly concerns the prevalence of child molestation. Even the last statistic that 90% of victims know their perpetrator is completely irrelevant to the question whether we need stigma against pedophiles. It doesn't even say the victims know their offender to be a pedophile or knew he was a pedophile before offending. It just says they know the perpetrator. Indeed, one major effect of stigma is that it ensures pedophiles stay in the closet. Therefore, it seems that if anything, through stigmatization, there are more pedophiles who we don't know are pedophiles, meaning it's just as easy for them to seek opportunities to be around kids than it's for anybody. Now, compare this to a hypothetical world without stigma, where these individuals may come out to people as maps. Earlier, Quinton insists we ought to be on guard around pedophiles. But surely, in order to be on guard around a pedophile, you first have to know they are one. And if you're going to posit that stigma safeguards children against pedophiles who already offended and are publicly known as offenders, why not just have stigma against these sex criminals then? I mean, it seems completely superfluous to shun pedophiles when we could just be against offenders to achieve the same protective effect. In fact, I'd even agree that there's value in socially condemning bad behavior. This should also work as a sufficient deterrent for the undetected and hitherto law-abiding pedophiles, as there'd be no question of our society rising in collective judgment against them if they should cross the line. Furthermore, by allocating the blame against offenders solely, we'd be imposing the negative effects of stigma on a much smaller population and with far better justification. After all, if we ought to be judgmental against people for some social purpose, it really seems that should be based on their bad choices rather than a characteristic they can't help, their sexuality. If you're doubtful about these negative effects of stigma I mentioned, just keep watching, I'll get to that eventually.
Now, an argument that I've heard is that normalization of the sexual attraction is necessary for these individuals to receive treatment. Basically, that the stigma surrounding it is keeping these individuals from receiving treatment. And I really interpret this as a statement that an individual's innate reaction to want to protect their children is what is leading to their children being hurt, which to me seems like gaslighting 101.
So our expert on gaslighting has now concluded also parents are guilty of it. Or did he mean they're victims thereof? I don't know, I'm beginning to feel he's gaslighting me right now, but let's see how he actually deals with this argument.
And if we look at the research that has been done on this, that statement just seems false. A study found that out of a sample group of people who describe themselves as minor attracted persons, it showed that 75% of them did seek formal help from a professional Now, if we compare that to the average percentage of individuals with mental illness who received treatment in 2018, we see about a 30% increase from the national average of everybody who has a mental illness. Now, personally, I'd like all of those numbers to be 100%, but there's no way that you can tell me, based on what statistics say, that individuals who are attracted to children are less likely to receive treatment than anyone else with a mental illness. And there's nothing to suggest that the current stigma surrounding being sexually attracted to children is what is keeping those individuals from getting help.
That's just such bullshit. First off, the argument isn't that MAPS are less likely to receive treatment than other individuals with a mental illness. That's your straw man, Quinton. The argument is that stigma affects their therapy-seeking behavior, and that's what you're supposed to address, you silly person. Now, in the study Quinton provides, 75% of their sample comprising of MAPS report having sought professional help, but this in no way proves stigma doesn't have a negative effect on pedophiles' therapy-seeking behavior. Imagine a statistic according to which 75% of adults eat ice cream on winter. Surely it doesn't follow from this that change of seasons has no effect on ice cream sale. After all, the percentage could rise up to 80% or 90% by summer, when it's warmer and nicer to eat some ice cream. In the same vein, the statistic that 75% of MAPS seek help informs us in no way how high the percentage would go without stigma. Regardless, 75 seems like a surprisingly high percentage, so what should we make of it? If we look at the title and abstract of the study, the main objective appears to have been to examine the experiences of MAPS regarding their treatment. Hence, for this research to accomplish this, it seems they'd have to focus on MAPS who have sought help and have these experiences to begin with, right? I'm not suggesting the sample is skewed or bad, but merely that it appears to be tailored for this purpose. And what corroborates my interpretation is the fact that they use a non-random, purposive sample of MAPS, meaning the subjects were selected using a significant amount of discretion. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a free access version of this paper, so take this with a grain of salt, but it really seems this study is structured in such a way as to not allow us to make the straightforward inference that 75% of MAPS try to seek help, as the sample just might not be representative. That is, the study might be accurate about how many pedophiles who do seek help find it useful, while not providing as precise information on how many pedophiles seek this help in the first place. However, there have been other studies regarding this, such as these two surveys by Before You Act from 2011. Let me paraphrase some of the findings to show that they differ from what Quinton puts forth. 59% of the MAPS disagreed that they would seek professional help for their pedophilia if needed. 42% said they had received professional help for their attraction to kids, and they were highly mixed in their satisfaction of this treatment. 58% said they would have wanted to see a mental health professional due to their attractions, but did not do so. These were the top 5 barriers, and I quote, 78% fear of negative reaction by the professional, 78% fear of being reported to law enforcement, 68% fear of being reported to family, employer, or community, 54% uncertain how to find a knowledgeable professional, 43% professionals are not knowledgeable about attraction to minors, 71% said they haven't seen a mental health professional for an issue related to their attraction to kids. These results are really interesting, but we gotta move on. The link to these surveys is in my description, so feel free to delve into further details yourself. To summarize, these figures put the number of pedophiles who get help to around 30 or 40%, which is much less than the 75% suggested by Quinton's paper that, again, doesn't seem representative of the whole population of MAPS anyway. But more importantly, whatever the percentage is, it doesn't address, let alone refute the claim that stigma affects therapy-seeking behavior. For Quinton to imply otherwise, it's just his failure to perform basic logic.
Now, another argument that I've heard is that minor-attracted persons state they are afraid to seek out help because of a mental health professional's duty to warn. And if you're not familiar with the duty to warn, it is the obligation of mental health professionals to warn third parties whom their clients intend to harm or who might be able to protect a suicidal client from self-harm. Now, some laws, dependent on state, can vary and can change this. But that isn't really an excuse to not seek out treatment, because in the majority of cases, it is not going to apply.
Basically, Quinton talks about the duty to warn here, pointing out how this law is supposed to only apply to cases where individuals intend to harm others or are suicidal. But if the caveat is that the laws might still vary depending on the state, as Quinton admits, that definitely complicates things, not to mention how therapists might just plainly misunderstand them. Mandatory reporting laws make it incredibly risky for pedophiles to tell therapists about their desires. In Canada, one is only required to report to the police if a specific child is at risk, but the laws can be misunderstood by mental health professionals, says Cito. Every state has laws that require healthcare professionals to report suspected child abuse, laws that are broadened when high-profile cases like Penn State occur. Many mental health workers, fearful for their own liability, may rush to report a client who says that he has been thinking about abusing children, concluding that he must be an imminent threat. The result is that men who are grappling with the attraction and other mental health issues that emanate from it, depression is common, have nowhere to go. My 2 cents is that while I agree it's unlikely that a non-offending MAP who doesn't express an intention to break the law would get reported, this fear might still be to an extent justified, owing to the arbitrariness regarding how these laws actually operate and may be interpreted by the mental health professionals. That being said, if you are a pedophile and feel you might be a threat to children, I think there's still an obligation to try to seek help, regardless of anything else. The obligation of society, in turn, is to ensure these reporting laws won't affect non-offending MAPs who just want help.
Now, in that study that I mentioned earlier that references the percentage of minor attracted persons who did seek out treatment, it did state that a little under half of them actually found that treatment was useful. And so that begs the question, is there a treatment for a sexual attraction to children?
What we witness here, I think, is mental health master sort of guiding the viewer to his next topic, which is whether pedophilia can be cured. I have structured my response in such a way that I'll cover this in the next part. Nonetheless, I can't resist the temptation to point out something. Also, I feel I haven't yet demonstrated the adverse effects of stigma well enough. Yes, I've made some remarks insinuating that, and hopefully I've successfully exposed Quinton's arguments to be seriously lacking. But I haven't really substantiated my own contention that stigmatization of pedophiles is not only redundant, but it's in fact counterproductive. That is, it's not just unnecessary, it's harmful to pedophiles and children alike, and I have evidence for this. Although, let's first deal with this clip. I just love how Quinton ignores what's in his own screen cap here. First off, out of these 4 barriers or obstacles to help seeking, as many as 3 are stigma related, 1 explicitly so. Additionally, out of the 3 characteristics for helpful therapeutic encounters listed in this abstract, I would argue 2, or perhaps even all 3, are stigma related. By the way, why I associate knowledge about minor attraction with stigma is because of a concept called courtesy stigma. It's basically stigma that extends from the primary group that is stigmatized to those who associate with them. And one way to associate with a stigmatized group is to study their condition. I discuss courtesy stigma more in my video titled 5 Effects or Biases Concerning Maps. Now, it's completely beyond me why this guy would use a source that mainly debunks his own argument. It's like he only read what he wanted to get confirmation about, which is that 75% of pedophiles in that sample had sought help, and completely skipped over the negative effects of stigma that were right under his nose. Because I happen to derive great pleasure in being a mean cunt to bullies and bigots, I'm actually going to provide more evidence. Next you'll hear a bunch of quotes from different studies. This medley of excerpts is meant to demonstrate the academic consensus that stigmatization of pedophiles seems detrimental to our goal to protect children. So just sit back and listen. The amount of stigma and its negative impact on stigmatized individuals has been comprehensively documented for ethnic minorities, obesity, social status, diseases, and mental disorders. Stigmatization has also been investigated with regards to homo and bisexuals, and to a lesser degree other sexual minorities like transgender people. Belonging to a stigmatized group may not only reduce the quality of life, but might also lead to self-harm, including drug abuse, suicidal behavior, and reluctance to seek help if it includes being labeled as a member of a stigmatized group. While we do in no way wish to downplay or legitimize the severe crime that is child sexual abuse, we have reasonable grounds to believe that stigma against people with pedophilia is doing a disservice to the prevention of this particular form of violence. Firstly, public stigma is likely to discourage individuals who perceive themselves at risk of committing sexual offenses from seeking help among health professionals or their friends and family, cutting them off from sources of social control and support. Furthermore, a lack of positive identification models, reduced self-esteem, or other problems resulting from or maintained by stigmatization could lead to less sufficient attempts to deal with deviant sexual impulses. Therefore, stigmatization is likely to not only contribute to higher risk of social, emotional, and cognitive problems amongst persons with pedophilia, but also to higher risk of abusive behavior. As has been shown for many other mental disorders, trouble and suffering does not only arise from the symptoms of the disorder, but also from unfavorable societal reactions. For many people with a mental disorder, fears of being stigmatized as such hold them from seeking professional help, and leads to lower levels of self-esteem and self-efficacy. We argue that confusing the logically distinct categories of pedophilia and child sexual abuse does not only create an enormous social and emotional burden for the discredited people with pedophilia, who see their life opportunities diminished because of a condition they could neither choose nor change, but that stigmatization of atypical sexual interests can also influence sexual and non-sexual behavior of stigmatized individuals. In the case of people with pedophilia, fear of discrimination may lead to social isolation, and thus a reduction of social control of pedophilic sexual urges, as well as the chances to implement preventative measures. As healthcare professionals live and work in an environment where many people have little regard for the needs or even basic human rights of people with pedophilia, they may feel reluctant or discouraged about offering help to patients with pedophilia. The experience of being turned away or treated unempathetically by a healthcare professional in a situation of heightened vulnerability is likely to be particularly stressful for a patient with pedophilia who might have no one else to turn to. One main ramification of having a sexual interest in children, even if one does not act on it, is that these individuals are likely to face intense stigma due to their pedophilic interest, and because of this stigma-related stress, be at increased risk of negative mental health and interpersonal outcomes. Stigma for non-offending pedophiles is an important area to research because the negative outcomes associated with stigma-related stress, for example social and interpersonal problems, emotional dysregulation, limited life opportunities, are also theorized to be central risk factors for the initiation of sexual offending. Loneliness and social rejection are key risk factors in etiological theories of child sexual abuse, as well as being linked to suicidality, reduced intelligent thought, and decreased self-regulation. Stigma reduction efforts may be a key aspect in encouraging individuals struggling to cope with pedophilic interests to seek help, since stigma is a major impediment to seeking mental health treatments. Given the emerging findings on stigma, mitigating the negative impacts of the experience of stigma associated with having a pedophilic orientation may be an important aspect of treating non-offending pedophiles. Existing studies reflect that although men attracted to minors desire treatment and support, they are unlikely to seek it out. Stigma and fear, both real and perceived, are likely deterrents to therapy-seeking behavior. So it's important to understand how much of an impact labeling, undesirability, adversity, disconnection, status loss, and discrimination has when considering therapeutic services. This data authorize confirmation that not all child sexual offenders have pedophilia, as well as that not all pedophiles are perpetrators. Every effort that can be made to combat the stigma inherent in this paraphilic condition is very important, since its harmful effects have been known for decades. And in this third situation, stigma is an additional complicating factor for these patients to seek therapeutic help. It may be constructive for professionals working with this population to encourage the ownership of the minor-attracted sexual identity, such as the reduced levels of self-stigmatization and increased self-acceptance. In doing so, we argue that we as professionals and as a society can empower MAPS to take control of their own destinies, work constructively toward living a good life, improve MAP well-being, and ultimately protect children from sexual harm by improving MAP well-being and agency. Mental ill health was found to be highly prevalent in this sample, supporting previous studies. These psychopathologies, combined with the naivety and stigmatization by society and clinicians alike, puts this population at increased risk of harming themselves and children. It is hoped this report will contribute to a literature that continues to grow and has a positive effect on the quality of life of MAPS. An effective way to protect children from abuse is to protect MAPS from reaching crisis points which may result in offending. Engaging in sexual contact with a child in any sense is morally wrong and deserving of punishment. Being born with an unwanted sexual attraction is not. That should be enough for now. There's so much to discuss with just these quotes, but to not drag this on, I'll contain myself to just commenting on 2 points. Even though the first excerpt doesn't mention pedophiles specifically, that paper is still about them. And if we acknowledge stigma to have negative effects on these various minorities, it's not reasonable to suppose pedophiles somehow escape them. Not that we don't have more direct evidence besides this, but I thought it honest to try to justify why I have that quote, so no one can make the accusation that I'm trying to obfuscate or gaslight anyone here. And secondly, I'd like to put forward a couple of simple arguments based on the excerpts 3D and 6. Both advocate for the need for the mental health professionals to mitigate the adverse effects of stigma in order to reduce the risk of offending. Now, if stigma truly was such a swell thing for these individuals and society, as Quinton argues, why the need for therapists to combat its effects? I mean, if these effects were in fact beneficial, you'd expect the therapist to rather reinforce them, right? In addition, since mitigating stigma-related effects takes up resources, removing stigma from the equation has the consequence of rendering help for pedophiles more effective, because treatment could now focus on other problems pedophiles might have besides anything stigma-related. To simplify, imagine that pedos have 3 problems related to their mental health that increase their risk of offending. If you take one of these problems completely away, not only does this itself reduce risk, but now society can allocate more resources on solving the 2 remaining problems, ergo the risk gets reduced even further. Now, if you're an anti-pedophile and think this is all just a bunch of bullshit, I challenge you to provide even one peer-reviewed study that challenges these views, essentially arriving at the opposite conclusion, that is, we need stigma against MAPS. I'm asking this because at least I've never encountered one. By the way, I used to hate pedophiles too, or perhaps fear is the better word. Arguably, all people start off as sort of anti-pedos, as they are molded into being one by our culture. However, some of us are fortunate enough to learn about the crucial distinction between pedophile and child molester, and many have the compassion and honesty to take that as an opportunity to refine their views. Others take this information and in their fearful bigotry become even more invested in their attempt to scapegoat this minority. And when these same people notice they've lost intellectually, they tend to resort to censorship and threats, rendering this debate a matter of upholding not only basic human rights of MAPS, but also freedom of speech and thought. Hopefully you found this video interesting. The next one will be part 3, in which I'll respond to the rest of Quinton's video. It will concern the problematics of whether pedophilia can be cured, and it should be up pretty soon as the script is ready. That's all I have. Thanks for listening.